and the week ahead. The oil markets ended, you would say, down on Friday and generally had a fairly soft week, struggling for WTI to get above 60 and for Brent to get too far away from 60. Let's kick off with Christof Rühl, our regular Sunday commentator, senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Christof, welcome back to the table. It seems the market is still a little bit uncertain about the demand recovery while supply looks abundant.
I think that's, good morning, John. I think that's roughly right. I mean, certainly there's uncertainty on the supply recovery outside the US and China, shall we say, mirroring what we all know, the economic performance, mirroring in turn the academic performance, pandemic performance. Yeah, I don't want to talk about it anymore. That's why the mind slips away.
It's nearly an academic subject.
Yeah, every time I think maybe I'm not going to force it, but maybe when will I see the first of these meetings, panels without the mentioning of COVID-19? But it seems to still be far away.
Well, we actually made a declaration in my house this weekend that we were now going to live in a post-pandemic world. I was wondering, we're going to have a revolution from the teenage kids if we didn't, but we're all vaccinated. We've all had antibody tests. So we're now living in what we consider a post-pandemic reality.
And okay, that's good for you, but you still can't travel anywhere because
Exactly.
Others are not, right?
I could go to my garden still, but nonetheless.
Okay. Well, here, here you see, this is Central Europe, the most, supposedly one of the most advanced spots on the planet. I'm not vaccinated, I'm a high risk guy. I can't get on any list. And they are talking about only one thing, which is, shall we have a much more severe, really hard 1 week lockdown or 2 week lockdown on top of everything, which people already had. And that's one of the problems. And that's one of the reasons demand is supposedly weak, because the European Union just continues to show how you cannot get your act together. It's just really amazing and embarrassing. But otherwise, I think the markets are also a bit confused on the supply side. I think it's pretty clear what's happening there, but the numbers sound bigger because the markets lump together what we discussed last Sunday, OPEC plus announcements and Saudi announcements, rather than understanding that one probably should treat these as two separate sticks and two separate carrots, which can be waved at separate moments by different actors. That will come back, so it will be a little bit choppy, but I think we are now in a new OPEC world. I think it's pretty clear. We have a corridor. I think we have sort of a target range. And the race is whether the price can stay between 60 and 65 with supply management and demand continues to catch up, so that after inventories next, these huge levels of spare capacity are worked off in an orderly fashion, or whether that will not be possible because shale and others will, shale and low demand perhaps, will come and spoil the party.
Let's welcome back John Roper, CEO, Middle East, Uniper Global Commodities. John, I wanted to kick off, given early April, a chance for a reflection on LNG over the course of the first quarter. It really was in a world of its own, seeing record high prices in February, dropping back. But if you could just give us an update on the journey of LNG and where we are now.
Hello, Sean. Hello, everybody. Well, I think we were all made aware that at the beginning of the year, we had unseasonably cold weather in Asia, particularly in Japan. We effectively had a number of factors that sort of came together to ensure that there was a severe shortage of prompt LNG. Spot tanker availability wasn't readily there in the market. And the three things coming together really made for very high prices in those countries that needed the LNG at that time. And we've certainly seen LNG prices come off. If you look at sort of average METI prices in March, they're about $6.50 a million BTU. In January, I think the average price was around the average of METI's recorded prices was around 18.5. And of course, we saw spot prices of nearly $40 a million BTU. So sort of markets are coming into the sort of demand and supply structure, I think, that analysts would normally expect at this time of the year. European.
Is there any legacy, do you think, John, from that record high $18+ we saw earlier in the first quarter?
I mean, a legacy in the way that companies that need LNG are going to make provision for requiring LNG. Yes, I expect there will be, but a lot of this is certainly in Japan is driven by the energy mix that they have. You know, Japan has not been able to bring its nuclear power plants back on at the speed that it wanted to. It still has a significant amount of coal and oil, and I think probably that scenario will stay. Because if there's too much dependence on the move to CCGT and gas burning, then you open yourselves up to these types of spikes.
There was an expectation pre this period that a lot of the US LNG and gas was going to be destined for the European markets. Does this Asia price point start to bring the idea of more LNG moving from America to Asia going forward?
Well, I mean, I think we've already seen that. I mean, the economics for US LNG work at these type of prices. I mean, European prices, if we look at TTF, I mean, it's about 6.5, 6.8, something like this at the moment, and spot prices in Japan are around 7.5, 7.3, something like that. So the economics start to work well. I think one of the interesting things, if you look at Texas freeze, if we could describe it as that, you had cargoes that were leaving the States that actually turned around and went back to the States to try and help out and put gas back in the system. So, you know, these infrastructure issues happen from time to time, and everybody tries to sort them out after the event. But I'm sure the industry will continue to be caught out on occasion.
Christof, the other big story last week was the Iran nuclear talks in Vienna. Generally, the sentiment coming out of the first week is the fact that there's going to be a second week, and even the Guardian newspaper out of the UK using the language of breakthrough. Your thoughts on these ongoing discussions, and if indeed they are contributing to a downward pressure on the oil price because of the possibility of a deal?
That's certainly both the case. But why should the Guardian? I thought they are a bit on the extreme side. So,
well, it's the one headline I saw that used the word breakthrough, whereas others were less.
They're in love with Biden, no? So, but okay. So I think yes, of the three events sort of which came out of last week, which would bridge into the future, the Iran talks were one. And this is actually a really interesting situation because you have on the one side the new American administration trying, to get as much things done as they possibly can during their first year in office, or probably the first 100 days, and doing a really good job at it in terms of the breadth of what they do and the preparations they have and the competence they have in place already. And Iran is certainly one of these items. And then on the other hand, you have elections in Iran coming up. And Iran is always sort of painted as the devil, but last time I looked at the Middle East, there were actually exactly two countries where you could not possibly forecast the result of an election. A small one, non-Arabic country, and a big non-Arabic country, and one of them was Iran. You have a very hardcore sort of leadership right now, and I don't understand enough of the inner workings of this Iranian system and the importance of the clerics and where they stand. But it could mean that they were trying to stall and not get a deal and continue their machinations in Lebanon and in Iraq and in all these other places. Or it could mean that for whatever internal reasons, there is indeed a window at which things going to happen quicker because they want to escape the sanctions and try to get some money for their oil, not just Chinese wear and tear. And I think the science, from which came out of these closed rooms so far, point rather in the direction that these talks hold some promise. And of course, the impact on oil markets would be immediate, and people would do the calculations. They would think that there's still between north of 1, maybe up to 1.5 or 2 even in the longer term million barrels per day, which could be released from Iran. And they will know that this will force OPEC Plus to sort of cut back a little bit again. And that will be a difficult thing to do. So every time you will hear good news coming out of these Iran negotiations or some white smoke out of the chimney, you will see an impact on the oil price. I think that is absolutely understandable and logical.
John, the other big story last week was Russian military buildup on the borders of Ukraine, and a variety of analysis as to whether the conflict in eastern Ukraine was going to boil over into something more substantial. My question really to you, less about the politics of that, but more about the gas supply into Europe. What's at stake here if indeed that region was to erupt into something a bit more disruptive?
Well, I think we've always been aware that flows through Ukraine have an impact. They've been impacted by discussions between Ukraine and Russia over the last few years. We have to be prepared for those type of interruptions, and I think if you only have to remember a few years ago where the flow of gas moved west to east in order to support countries in Eastern Europe when flows through Ukraine were slowed down and stopped by these type of political discussions. I would think that there are different routes of pipeline gas into Europe, and I'm sure those pipelines are going to be able to accommodate the requirements of those nations that need it. It's a bit of a long ask, Sean. And I think the politics will have to become very severe before people start to really start to pay attention to this. But I think this saber rattling does nothing for confidence in markets, and I think that's the loser.
Does it create, or is there any sort of obvious reaction yet to see more LNG cargoes going into Europe as a sort of counter to that, if indeed there was a disruption?
I can see Christof wanting to jump in, but I mean,
yeah.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I already had problems with the purely infrastructure-related explanation of the spike in prices in Asia.
Yeah.
There's one thing I didn't mention is, I mean, aside the infrastructure problems, which always happens, as John rightly said, you have three big reasons in Asia for LNG markets to expand and to grow and prices to face some upward pressure. And that's China. And the second one is China. And the third one is China again, to put it in a cheap way. Because their demand for gas is going to, by all accounts and their own plans, is going to escalate faster than they are prepared to do the things necessary to unlock domestic resources more efficiently, including shale resources. And on the other side of that, you have Russia. And this is, again, a situation where we can say more a little bit. There's a massive concentration of Russian troops, but it's still about 150 kilometers away from the border. And it's not in the Donetsk basin. It is at the closer by Voronezh in southern Russia, closer to the border of Ukraine proper. And one way to read this is that Russia is planning some big invasion into Ukraine. And the other way to read this is that it's saber rattling and putting Biden on the spot. And I think it's the latter. It's pretty clear. It fits into sort of previous pattern. But it's not just, to make political noise. The immediate consequence of any kind of disturbance in that was that it would support and harden the position of those in Europe who want the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, who want to get independent from this transit through Ukraine. And it is going to feed right into their positions. And since Biden's administration has disappointed a lot of people, again, at least in Germany, but I think in wider European Union now, by taking a very hardcore, what sounded like a hardcore critical stand against Nord Stream 2, that might be a reaction to this what was perceived as sort of political saber rattling from the US administration on the other side. And certainly plays into the hands of those who want to stiffen the resistance against giving up on Nord Stream.
And hence,
yeah, and Christof, that's a subject that I'm not allowed to talk about. So it's I'm glad you brought up your opinion.
There's clearly some politics and going on there, you would say, vis-a-vis the different stir. We had a commentator on last week out of Russia who was signaling that the standoff on the Ukraine border could become something more serious as we come out of the winter into the summer. And one of the geopolitical flashpoints to keep an eye on there. John, going back to the OPEC decision recently to increase oil supplies into the second quarter of May, June, and so forth. The prices have sort of, after an initial climb, have dropped away. What's your views on where that supply story is going, given the uncertain demand recovery?
What, out of the US or
no,
just...
out of OPEC Plus, their decision to raise supply into the second quarter, where demand doesn't appear to be solidly supporting, at least if you wanted to keep prices up towards 70 and not closer to 60.
I think, these monthly meetings that are taking place give everybody the opportunity to address that issue. I think at the moment, there was a sense that there was going to be a demand recovery. I think if we look at sort of infection rates in Australia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh at the moment, I mean that's inevitably going to give people pause for thought to see if this is a real demand recovery, or whether the rest of the year and future years, because I'm not convinced this is going to have a happy ending at the end of this year. I think there's going to be volatility for a good while yet, and the people that manage this market will be playing an active role, I would think, on a monthly basis.
The outlook for this idea of a 3-month deal they've announced through to July, you would question, in essence, the impact of that, given that this will be reviewed every month. So after 1 month, there's no real certainty.
Well, I think Christof picks up the point that you've got a significant volume coming into the market, and yet prices are not quite sure where to go, and that reflects the demand uncertainty that the market is showing.
Christof,
this 3 months planning ahead, this is from the playbook of central banks. This is forward guidance. He said this is what we're going to do, except of course the data change, and boosted by the additional split with independent actions of Saudi Arabia. It's brilliant.
I mean, we did get a very large version of that last year, and then they abandoned it. The idea that we got even a 2-year forward
guidance. We got a 2-year plan last year in an emergency situation, and a pretty quick realization that by November it was way off track, and for understandable reason, because nobody could predict the pandemic and the consequences. And so then we got this kind of steer around in a narrow space. Now it looks more settled. Now they give themselves a 3-month window. I think this makes sense. And I think it makes sense to meet every month and negotiate it again. Yeah, the only thing missing is the transparent publication of the minutes, like every good central bank does. That I would like to see too.
You need those to be leaked. John, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I think, and also, with this 3-month, let's call it central bank guidance. I like that description. It also doesn't require leaks ahead of time. The market gets used to what is expected in a manageable period of time, and if that is changed on a rolling basis, then I think that's the type of guidance that markets can start to get to grips with.
Christof, I suppose they would have to be somewhat contented that after generally market acknowledgement that Iran has increased exports to 1 million barrels a day, and they've now, OPEC Plus have announced another 2 million over the May to July period. So that's 3 million plus. That prices staying in the 60s is in essence a positive with all of that extra supply.
Yes, and it shows. So first of all, you have to be a bit careful. I was a little bit ironic because, of course, central banks don't have the coordination problem between different members of an association wants to do something, and it's hard to find someone voluntarily printing more money just by making more money.
Yes.
But forwards guidance is certainly what they had in mind, and to your point, yes. I think this underlines that markets have something realized which not all analysts have realized, which is that we have an OPEC Plus policy, and a Saudi backup. This is not, I mean, we had the discussion last Sunday. This is not 2 million barrels thrown in the market. This is 700,000, as Mike said last time, per month. And in reality, it's 350,000 or 400,000 per month, because one player is on the sidelines and has given itself, Saudi Arabia, given itself a big tool to play with, and has demonstrated in the past that they're quite willing to use it up or down, cutting or producing more. And that sort of bolsters the case for OPEC Plus, because that can counterbalance any kind of cheating, which they will find harder and harder over time to counter. And they know that this will become harder and harder with prices in the current range. And that, with the 3-month warning signal, also puts them actually in a quite comfortable position to react should something happen, like a sudden rise of exports from Iran, a sudden increase in shale, or any of these kind of things. And I do think the price reaction which we see at the moment is not the markets being stupid enough to think that global demand look like American gasoline demand this summer. It's the markets realizing that they have a quite sophisticated differential set of toolbox there on the other side, and that they have done a surprisingly good job so far.
Let's give the room a view on the current state of oil prices. What is the most pressing issue keeping oil prices closer to 60 a barrel than 70? Inevitably, one might say all of the above, but which do you think is the most pressing? The OPEC increase of supply, the Iran-US rapprochement, or the uncertain vaccine rollout that we're seeing? Some countries doing it very well, many doing it very poorly. So which one of these do you think is the one that has the extra muscle keeping prices pushed lower? And if it was removed, prices would climb, I suppose, is the flip side of that view. Let's talk, John, a little bit about next week. The week ahead, inevitably, we have the British government announced plans for reopening of the UK economy. While, of course, it's not in itself a significant, it's not going to change the direction of travel and many things, but ultimately it does set a tone for there is a recovery, there is a major economy opening up. Travel plans will be announced in the coming weeks. Others can follow this model.
Well, I think, look, I think others can follow the model when there is a significant percentage of the population vaccinated. However, I'm not someone that is terribly optimistic about the way that COVID is going to be dealt with. I think it's going to be with us for forever. And I see countries battling with this fear of surges in infections over the next 2 to 5 years, handling it in potentially different ways depending on where their vaccination program is. It's certainly good news for people in the UK that there is a degree more freedom. You know, we're very lucky here that we have a significant amount of freedom because we do seem to be managing this small population, relatively small population, well. I'm afraid, Sean, I'm just not optimistic about it. Clearly, it will have an effect on the economy, yes, with people requiring more things. The idea of being able to travel, okay, let's just wait and see.
What would you point to, let's say next week or the coming weeks, John, that would give this somewhat now stagnant oil market, one would say, looking for some wind in its sails? What could be the wind in the sails to move this price off of this kind of stuck in the low 60s since the OPEC meeting?
Well, the only thing that's going to move it is a significant increase in demand. And I struggle to see where that will come from. And Christof just touched on gasoline usage in the US over the summer. There is a sense that's going to move gasoline prices up, with creating more mobility for people. If the aviation industry could get back into the market, then aviation fuels, refineries producing more of it. All of these things have to come together, I think, rather than one single item.
But it's still a supply control market, ultimately, until demand is of note.
It's a supply managed market, yes.
We have oil coming out of our ears, right? I mean, It's actually surprising there's such an excess supply, there's such an excess capacity. It's, to me, if anything, surprising that we have prices north of 60 for Brent.
Well, there's their confidence, I suppose, in the OPEC management. Let's get the survey result and see where the room's at on that. Big sort of emphasis on the vaccine rollout, and inevitably that does feel like it is the gateway to that demand recovery that John mentions. Christof, looking to next week, what might you be watching for guidance?
I think some of the issues we touched upon, they have really bridges into the medium-term future. One is Iran, for all the reasons we discussed, so that will continue. That's one to watch. Could go either way in my uninformed judgment on that issue, and whichever way it goes will have an impact. The second one is Russia, but not. I wouldn't classify this as a sort of Russia problem. I think as we have this kind of K-shaped recovery with some falling by the wayside and some doing very well, we will see more of the tensions coming back. And we've seen this already. I mean, we have problems not only in Russia, but we had problems in Jordan last week. We had the constant needles of attack from Yemen against Saudi Arabia requiring some sort of response at some point. We had this unresolved problem, which is Lebanon in the region. So there is enough hotspots which have been very quiet, maybe because demonstrators and warriors had to stay at home and were in lockdown, but couldn't go out without a mask shouting. But this will all come back. So Russia is a symbol for trouble on the political front, reaching back in the future. And then the third one is really this bifurcation in the world between the haves and have-nots in terms of the vaccine and the role of the European Union there. That is quite dramatic because we will have a lot of elections in Europe too this year. It's not just Iran. So Germany has an election in September. This is now likely to go the way of being a big disappointment for the Christian Democrats from Merkel's party. Merkel is not running anymore, but this party is going to lose its status as the biggest party because of the mess up with the vaccine. France has elections in the not too distant future. Macron is already sort of struggling to stem the tide from the nationalists under Le Pen. So this mess up in Europe in terms of being incapable of vaccinating their population fast enough will have political consequences precisely because Europe isn't going to stay a democracy where these things have an echo effect. And that is not going to be pleasant all over the place.
The other point, just looking ahead to the week ahead, and it's something obviously that we have been watching regularly on this show, has been the continued sort of face-off with China and the West, or China and America. And now as Biden starts to choreograph a sort of unified position with Europe and other countries to engage with China, we've seen the possibility of China-EU relations going a little bit awry with a major investment agreement that was on the threshold of being approved, an EU-China investment pact that was agreed in late 2020, but has now sort of fallen, or at least has stopped in the approval process in the European Parliament because of this. The EU sanctioned some Chinese officials on the back of the human rights violations in China. China responded by sanctioning some EU members of parliament. And now we have a standoff, and this major investment bill, fallen in the middle. I highlight it just as the latest incident of that crevice between China and the West, China and America, now Europe. There was a very useful audio podcast on the Daily Digest today on the subject, are the US and China entering a Cold War? It's a Financial Times podcast with a senior US analyst, formerly of the Obama administration, security analyst, talking about that subject and where it goes. I think one should always have one eye on it, given the ramifications of how significant it is. And the one point that she makes in that was the potential of a mistake triggering a major moment, which clearly there's a lot of posturing going on, but there's so much posturing going on the potential for an error to trigger something more significant is what keeps her up at night. And I think it's something we should all, those engaged in the markets, keep an eye on. But that's, sorry, Christof, you want to jump in?
This is one of these things, where we talked about long-term trends being accelerated by the pandemic, and this move to a more sort of binary world with both China and the US advancing and then dueling it out at some point, rather than a multipolar world about which so many people spoke about a year ago, is certainly one of these things which seems to come out of last year. Those two.
Yeah. And whether that ends up being a proxy issue or whether it ends up being, face to face, is one to, and it manifests itself in many small areas, and LNG exports into China. Who knows? They may become the next.
It means that binary duels means that people will have to take sides. They will be forced, which is one thing frightening Europe again.
Well, a number of companies that have been slapped by China recently for mentioning issues, Nike in particular, but others as well. John, you want a last comment on that?
No, I was just going to make the observation that I think this pause in ratification of this EU-China treaty gives the Biden administration time to reach out to European leaders to perhaps formulate a more coordinated discussion with China. I mean, there was a perception that the EU was just going off and doing its own thing with China. And I think there were a number of reports about how irritable this was to the incoming administration before they'd had a chance to reach out and try and befriend Europe again. Of course, they had not been doing that for the last couple of years. So maybe there could be more consensus about how to deal with China. And it's not seen in the context of such a bilateral boxing match.
And let's wrap it up there. Just to note, condolences to all our British viewers for the passing of Prince Philip, the husband of the Queen. Sad day for everybody who supports the British crown. So condolences on that. John, thank you very much for your time today. Christof, thank you as always for your insights. And everybody else, have a great week. We'll catch you every morning, 10:30 UAE time. All the best.
Bye, everybody.